All right. Thank you to everyone for coming out on a cold winter's night to talk about planning and zoning. We'll call the meeting to order here at 7:01, and we'll start off with roll call. Why don't we start with you, Amy?
I'm here, Amy Rodnick.
Alex Robinette.
Jordan Scott Chair.
Josh McKay.
All right. Thank you. Tony's out of town, and I know Brian has some conflicts. He may try and sneak in, but we're going to start with the crew we've got. Are there any public comments for items not on the agenda? None? All right, hearing none, we will then move into our consent agenda. Do I have a motion to pass the consent agenda, which consists of our minutes from the previous meeting?
I motion to accept the meeting minutes from the meeting on January 14th, 2020.
Fantastic. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. Any other further discussion on those minutes? All right, hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. All right, motion passes unanimously. We're now going to open up public hearing at 7:03 to discuss potentially changing the city's code of ordinances to allow financial institutions, including banks and savings and loans, in our C2 zoning district. You'll recall in your minutes as well, we did not take action in the last meeting. We did not create a motion to pass our action, which then doesn't give guidance to city council, so they were unable to really discuss it. In the meantime, we've had a request from the applicants to consider the possibility of actually changing the not the zoning ordinance, but changing, enabling a special use permit that would allow financial institutions. So rather than changing the entire zoning, we could also change the special use permit. However, Charlie, are we allowed to discuss that given what was noticed? Do you feel like it falls underneath that noticing procedure? That was my one question.
Yeah, yes, yeah. So the request is a more intensive. The agenda item is a more intensive request. In other words, the request currently as the agenda item is to amend the zoning code to authorize the use of a savings and loan institution by right within the zoning district. It sounds like that they were requesting that you consider to instead make a recommendation that you will allow savings and loan institutions by special use permit instead of by right. That's a lesser inclusive, lesser intensive request, and so that would be allowable for you to do under this posting.
Fantastic. I'm open to discussion on it.
I do have a question. Do we need to go ahead and make a motion since we chose not to make action last time on, as it states in number 3, as we all discussed, we weren't in favor of changing everything in the city for one purpose. Do we need to address that and then address?
No, it's all-inclusive discussion.
Okay.
Because ultimately, what I want to hear from the body is a motion to approve the request or deny the request. Okay. And if they convince you that it should be by special use permit, then you can make a motion to authorize an amendment to the zoning code to allow it by special use permit. Either way, we need some affirmative. We need some action by this body where, I guess, the 4 of you, there's only 4 here, you would have to unanimously agree to that recommendation.
Okay. Well, we're in public hearing, so why don't we go ahead and hear from the applicants and anybody else who would like to talk on this. Is there a list, anything, or we just go?
Nobody has signed up.
Nobody signed up. Does anybody from the floor wish to discuss? All right, please come on up and state your name for the record, please.
William Milligan with the Highline Group on behalf of Vista Bank. And let me just start by saying thank you for letting us come back out to revisit this topic or this request. We recognize that the city's has limited availability for commercial, whether new or redeveloping here in Rollingwood. We recognize that. We acknowledge that from the last conversation we had with you. We believe, though, Rollingwood has an advantage over any other neighboring city is due to your size and your stature, is you can actually look at each individual lot on a case-by-case basis because you have, a limited amount of lots. So we would actually like to modify our ask or request from last time to, instead of globally changing your C2 zoning to allow for banks or financial institutions in the C2 zoning just outright, we would like to ask that under section 169 in C2 zoning that the use financial institutions be brought in as allowable use to request a special use permit within the C2 zoning. So that way it's by having that in there, then we can actually go forward, ask for a special use permit for a particular lot that's in the C2 zoning, and we can then argue our case as to why, once we provide that special use permit, or we go for the special use permit application, we can then explain our case for the site as to why we feel the site would definitely be better for a financial institution use versus retail. Because we have a minimum lot size issue, we have a minimum floor area issue, we have minimum setbacks issue, and we have minimum permeable area, allowable area on the site issue with that site. That no retail, I believe, could actually fix those things that are currently caused by the zoning that's implied on that site. So, and if anybody has any questions for me, I'm okay with that.
Are there any questions for the applicant? Okay, hearing none right now. Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to speak on behalf of this topic? Thank you. And appreciate you speaking in the microphone and stating your name for the record.
My name is Brian May. I'm the president of Vista Bank here in Austin. About 3 years ago, I brought Vista Bank to this market. We're just one office with 4 people, so it's a very, very small bank here in Austin. I'm sure you heard the history of Vista Bank before, but we're a 108-year-old institution from, or based in West Texas, and brought the bank here. And so I am a Westlake resident. Live right down by Texas Honeyham. I would say 50% of our business is sourced out of the Westlake market just due to my local relationships here. I'm on the Eanes Education Foundation board, vice president on that board. And so with all the ties to this market, that is really why we originally came trying to find something. And as you all know, the moratorium on banks in Westlake and then the lack of options here in Rollingwood kind of led us to this site. I was not here in January, but I think our original intent was just to be able to put a financial institution into this one building and not try to rezone everything that you guys have in place already. So that's really the original intent. We're not looking to change anything blanket wide over the city. Ultimately, we would like to just put a small 1,200 square foot office on this site. And I think it makes sense because we have a ton of Rollingwood residents who are already customers, Westlake residents who are already customers. And with our local relationships, I think we're different than a lot of the banks that are currently serving this market. So, again, we hope that you guys would take up this request, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. May. Any questions for Mr. May from the dais? All right. Anyone else who would like to speak during the public meeting? This is your chance. Okay. Hearing no one else, we're going to go ahead and close the public meeting at 7:11. Okay, good question on, we do need to take action, so there will be a motion. I'll just say as chair, we're open to motions. We need to finish this off with one to make sure we make a recommendation to council. As you guys know, the process is then council will act upon in whichever way they choose to do it. Charlie, I'm putting you a bit on the spot, and I apologize for not
That's
having
all right.
asked this earlier.
No, it's okay.
You've taken me through this a while ago. do you want to take the rest of the crew through the
That's why
special
it's
use
back?
permit?
Oh, the special
The
use
special
permit.
use permit, how that works. We've talked about it. Just want to make sure everybody understands what happens when we give a special use permit, or adding this as a use to it doesn't necessarily require that we then enable this particular property or any other property a special use permit. But I'd love for you to first take on the process of, if we choose to go forward or not go forward, what happens? And then also just how long do special use permits last? You took us through it before. And
Sure. So, so in zoning, you have a few different ways you can acquire a use on a piece of property. The most common way, or the most traditional way, better, I guess is the better way to say it, is by right. You zone a district, a particular zone. There's a list of uses that you're authorized to do within that zone, and so long as the area is zoned and allowed for that particular use, you just have to go through the permitting process, or if you're going to build, and you don't have to do anything with respect to zoning, except comply with whatever zoning regulations are in place with respect to setbacks and things of that nature. There's a process called a special use permit, a conditional use permit, where you have a zoning district and you have a use that you might like to allow in that particular zoning area, except that maybe there are some conditions that you want to make sure that are attached to it before it's authorized. And so it's listed in the zoning district as allowed through either a conditional use or a special use permit. And then there is a set of criteria that must be complied with. And instead of being able to do it by right, they then have to come back to the planning and zoning commission and go through the rezoning process. It's actually a rezoning. It's called a permit, but it's actually a legislative act, just like rezoning. So they would go, oh, we can do this by special use permit. So they put together whatever it is they're required to put together to prove that they're entitled to the special use permit. They file an application for a special use permit with the city. It comes to the city council, comes to the planning and zoning commission. The planning and zoning commission analyzes the special use based on where it wants to be located, based on the conditions that the code requires to be met, and makes a recommendation to city council. City council then analyzes the same thing, takes into consideration the recommendation from the planning and zoning commission, and either approves or denies the special use permit. So it's, even though we use the term permit, it's really not a permit, it's a legislative act that authorizes a particular use based on certain conditions that the community has determined are appropriate for that type of use in the area where it's allowed. How long do special use permits last? Into perpetuity. They run with the land, they don't run with the owner. And so if a special use permit is granted for a particular piece of property, it is for the property, it is not for the owner, and it doesn't matter if it's this, if those people sell the property later, the special use permit would still be authorized on that land regardless.
if there's a change of use during the special use permit, so they change from the special use back to an approved use under that particular zoning, do they lose the special use in the change of use? It is permanently with that piece
Yes,
of property.
yes.
If they combine, not subdivide, but if they subdivide the property, how does that work? And then if they combine it with another property, how does that work?
Those are subdivision issues, not zoning issues.
So
and it
the
would
zoning
go through,
stays.
yeah, it would go through a different process.
It's through a different process.
This is a lot of hypotheticals,
Yep.
but there's a variety of things that could occur. They could, a subdivision could, adding a piece to it could, from a subdivision standpoint, could work. But if it creates a non-conforming structure, then they would be subject to whatever non-conforming structure regulations are in place. So there's just a lot of ifs associated with that question. The main point to make is that the subdivision process is a different process from the zoning regulations, and so they would, if they could comply with the requirements for subdivision, then they could do so. It may create a non-conforming structure, it may not create a non-conforming structure, I don't know.
For that section, which is chopped up into smaller properties, what you hear the most being contemplated is the combination of the properties into one. I don't know if that would,
That's subdivision, that's subdividing.
that's subdividing, okay.
It's the plat, subdividing is kind of, yeah, it's kind of, it's a misnomer almost, because you're,
No, I get
it's the
that.
platting
Yeah.
process, right? So when you they would be replatting a piece of property by removing a lot line, for example, and so
Yes.
replatting two
Replat,
pieces of property into one piece of property, but it's still quote-unquote subdivision.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what zoning remains when you.
The same zoning
Same-
stays in place.
stays in
Again,
place, special
the
use.
platting process, the subdivision process is a separate process.
Okay.
It runs independent of the zoning, and you could, replat a piece of property that has a structure on it and create a non-conforming structure.
Yeah.
The non-conforming structure could continue to exist, the use could continue to exist, but it would be subject to whatever non-conforming regulations are in place with the city.
Okay. Those are my questions. It's pretty technical. Any other questions from y'all?
Well, one question I have, I don't doubt that the speakers are sincere and want to be good neighbors, and but one group of people I have not heard from this time that we did hear from somewhat last time and on other matters are, I know Tom Farrell came and expressed some concerns about this not being retail that would contribute to the city's tax base. And that we already have a number of financial institutions in Rollingwood. The other issue is the commission that has been set up to look at redeveloping Rollingwood and the corridor along there. And I don't want to really say yay or nay, but I would like more information, and I would have liked to have heard from members of that committee about how they see this use fitting in with the plans for that corridor and for redeveloping Rollingwood.
Yeah, I don't know if that committee's
I mean,
formally been established.
I know Alex
Yeah.
is on it, right?
Well, only
In name.
having stuck up my hand is as far as that's gone. I don't think that the committee has met. My understanding is there's a full report that does discuss these things. So while nobody has come forward to specifically talk about it, we could all go read about it. Is that a true statement?
It was in your, the two reports we've got have been in your packet for last packet, which is still available publicly. There's the one from the late 90s, I think, and then the most recent one as well. The one from the late 90s is pretty in-depth. The more recent one is a bit more, I get what, an initial report.
I guess my
Yeah.
comment would be that I think that we have to be careful with special use permits and that we don't want to lose the special. And that they really need to serve a real need. I don't think that more financial institutions are something that would qualify as special right now. And like Amy said, until we really get a chance to look at what options are available, because I think that a lot of people are pretty motivated to get some additional amenities for our city that include retail and restaurants and things that can bring our city together. And I also understand your comment that that lot is limited in size and therefore use. But I don't think that a bank is its only current use. I mean, you could sell tacos or, there are other things. It could be a walk-up restaurant just like Mr. Gaddy's. But that said, I think we are right on the cusp of a larger issue of looking at all of that. And I don't think we want to limit ourselves by turning that into a bank and then really being unable to redevelop a lot of those other things around there.
So, if I understand it correctly, the consideration tonight is not whether or not we would allow that property to become a bank. The question tonight is whether or not we should allow banking to be part of the C1 C2, sorry, C2 special uses. So the question is, do we allow that? They would then have to come back and reapply. And to be clear, and I think we discussed this with the applicants previously, we could allow banking within C2 and yet still not allow it for this property, or not recommend it. It's not up to us in the end, it's up to council. But the question comes down to, do we want to allow it in C2? The weird bit we see between our C1 and C2 is they're so almost very much similar. It's kind of, why do we have two? And so one of the things we had contemplated or been asked prior to the bigger corridor study was, should we just get rid of one of these things and have everything be the same? Just C, commercial zoning, no 1 and 2. I think this is one reason you see a C2 is you can limit some additional uses, or perhaps make them special uses. If I take myself out of this particular property, so not making any stay on this property, I don't have a problem with putting a special use and giving this council and future councils the tools by which to choose to do something or not do something through the special use. I was very hesitant, I think we all were, about changing the entire zoning. Giving them a tool that they can then make a choice doesn't bother me. I'm sort of one that likes to have council have a lot of options and a lot of tools within their tool belt to decide what they may or may not want to do. So I'm a little concerned with the in perpetuity on a special use.
I got a motion.
Yeah, that's it. Josh, you got anything?
I got a motion
All right.
to deny this at this moment, just because we're at such a, I don't know,
Okay.
early stage of what we're trying to figure out, and we're not even really sure what we're figuring out yet, and I'd hate to, the in perpetuity part, I agree with Jordan, is what's the kicker here. We've got 5 financial institutions. I think we need to look at those reports and try to focus on what they say and what's, better, trying to get some more tax revenue in here for us as a city. Nothing against a certain property but I think we're served in that purpose already. So how would I motion it?
Motion to disapprove the request for the rezoning?
I motion to disapprove the request for zoning, as listed in item 3.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Anything else? Do we need to clarify that it's both?
No?
No, just motion to, okay.
I think he had
Well, it's not the,
Can I just bring some more information to light real quick?
Typically, this is not the point to do it. I want to give you a chance to have your say, but I would encourage you to say what you're going to say at council. That's not good with the motion on the table. It's pretty much in our hands now. All right, any further questions from the dais? Okay, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, say nay. All right, motion passes unanimously. Are we good on that for council?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, guys. Okay, 3 is done. Looking at our regular agenda now. We're looking at presentation discussion of the residential tree canopy management ordinance. Amy's gonna take us through flow charts. I have a tree on my property. Can you tell me whether it's permittable or not? I appreciate you being here, council member Amy Patillo. We appreciate you coming in and helping us take a look at the tree ordinance.
Great. Maybe I should clarify. So my impression is that y'all were wanting to look at considering recommendations for amendments to the tree ordinance.
I think it was a bit of history
Okay.
first.
Okay, you can do that first.
We can just kind of go through, give the history,
Okay.
how it came about, and then we can talk about what we're looking at today and
Okay.
any changes that may have come up now that we've been operating it for a little bit.
Okay, that's what I prepared. I just wanted to make sure I had prepared the right thing. I did not do flowcharts.
There are
Before
a lot of
slides.
flow charts in our book, though.
There are
like
part
a
of,
lot.
yeah,
They're
that's,
they're good.
if for people who are having to fill one out, I did go through and flowchart it. So, what I did is I kind of laid out a timeline, and I'm gonna walk through it, and if you need to stop me at any point for clarification, please feel free. And I'm hopefully going to summarize things that were large discretions into concise statements. So if I miss something, let me know. So the problem that existed that came to the council's attention in about September of 2018 was that there were multiple lots that had been purchased in the city and clear cut completely. And they were being purchased by developers who were coming in and removing all of the trees. There was also damage that was happening to trees in adjacent lots by some ways that people were starting to cut really close to property lines. So there was a growing concern about the number of trees that were disappearing in the city, and that there wasn't really any kind of backstop in the city to deal with our tree canopy and the disappearance. There was a general sentiment as I was out in the community that it wasn't just like the trees themselves, but also the canopy that the trees provide that is important to the appearance of the city and also the values of our properties collectively, and also provides important ecological and environmental benefits to residents, businesses, and our greater community. We do live right next to the Zilker Preserve, and we're part of a greater community here as well. So in 2018, though, specifically in September, at a council meeting, there was a group of neighbors who live on one of the streets who came, and I think there were 12 or 13 people who all gave comment at the beginning of the council meeting and said, you know, we need some type of backstop because another lot on our street has just been clear cut. So we listened to that. Councilmember Hunley and I decided that we would work together on trying to draft an initial take on a tree ordinance, and presented that at the October 2018 meeting. So one thing I wanted to point out is that when we initially drafted that ordinance in October of 2018, we drafted it to be in the zoning regs. And that's the way that we drafted the language. The city attorney did not review our draft before the council meeting. At that time, it was not Charlie. And just to clarify, so we got to the meeting, and the city attorney indicated that we would have to move the ordinance to Chapter 3 instead of it being in the zoning regs. We took comment during that meeting, but the intention initially was we're drafting this, and we assumed it was going to come to planning and zoning for review, and that be part of the discussion process. Instead, we came back in November. We had another draft that was in Section 3. We ended up having public hearings in November, December, January, and February at each of the council meetings. So we had 4 public hearings after that at the council meetings. So that's kind of the timeline. And then we ended up passing it in February of 2019. And we have made some small changes to it since then, but nothing very significant. Other than this body, once Charlie came on, moving it back into the zoning regs. So that's the timeline. I wanted to share kind of briefly some of the balancing issues that were behind the discussions that we were having as a council, and then also as Wendy and I were going out in the community and meeting with a lot of different people and looking at what a lot of other communities were doing and thinking about our community uniquely, some of the different interests that we balanced and what we got as a final product. So we started from the perspective that we have residents who both would not want any type of restriction from removing trees, and we also had residents who wanted no trees to ever be removed from properties ever again, right? So we had a pretty broad group of people potentially, and then we had a lot of people in the middle. And so we were trying to do something that would work for a large portion of our community to buy into this. This does reflect our community values and how we feel about the tree canopy in our city. So we started from the perspective that if trees were removed, if a part of our tree canopy was removed, that we needed to try to find a way to replace it. So that was kind of the middle ground of that, is like you could remove it, but if you remove it, you replace it. And that kind of seemed like the middle point between those two opposite places. We looked at the City of Austin ordinance related to trees, and we took the tree type list that is in the ordinance from the City of Austin list as a starting point. We also did something that I haven't seen in other ordinances, but we did it because there has been a lot of discussion at the council level about the setback areas of our properties being larger in our city, and that being kind of part of the community green space effectively that we've agreed that we're going to have. And so when we looked at the ordinance, when we looked at creating the ordinance, we distinguished between what is the buildable area in a lot versus the non-buildable area that's defined by the setbacks. And we also looked at the reality that with the drainage code now, with the drainage manual, that some of the back setbacks on properties are frequently being used as part of the drainage management as well, to avoid what we call at the council level the moat situation. So we also looked at that issue, and so we didn't include all the setback area. We included basically front and side as being areas where we said, okay, we want to figure out how to also incentivize people to keep their existing canopy in those green spaces and then replace the canopy that they're taking from their buildable area. So that was also another balancing thing. Councilmember Henley also brought in, I think it's really important, and I don't even see the City of Austin doing this in their own code, but City of Austin Electric has this packet of information about what types of trees should be replanted near power lines. And so we looked at that issue and also used the list that they had of trees that you should plant within a certain distance of power lines in our ordinance, so that if you're replacing trees near and you have power lines you're dealing with, that we're replanting trees instead of having giant oak trees that are going to then potentially fall on power lines in the future. We're replacing that canopy with trees that are more conducive to having your power lines. So that was another thing that we looked at. So this, I think, is kind of an issue where I think we're going to need to go back for a little bit of current legal counsel potentially. So in the first couple of drafts of the ordinance that we had, we went through and read, there's a state statute, it was House Bill 7 that was passed several years before we worked on the ordinance. And it effectively regulates what cities can do related to restricting removal of trees on private property. So I read through that statute, and the way I understood it was that if a city has an ordinance that says if you want to remove a tree, you have to pay a fee, the state statute then came and said, you also have to provide a way for people to replant trees. You can't only have a fee option. So if you're a city that only has a fee, you also have to allow for replanting trees. And in the state statute, the replanting of trees is also set then to 2 inches in diameter. So we looked at that. I read it. I went and reread through the statute again today. And I still read it as that was the state saying you can't pass a fine-only tree removal ordinance. So we didn't do a fine-only tree removal ordinance initially. We drafted it so that we were focused on people replacing tree canopy. That's what we want. So the initial thing is, if you want to remove a tree, then you have to come and get a permit and tell us that you're going to replace it with a certain type of tree. Here's the trees. Give us your plan. If you do not want to do that, then you can pay a fine. So we kind of flipped the issue, and we were providing both things. I felt like that was a correct reading and interpretation of the state statute. We went through 2 or 3 meetings before Doug actually read what we had drafted, our previous council, and then told us that we could not do that. So we then had to redraft the ordinance to remove the option to pay a fee. So now we just have the option to replant, because basically the option that we were given is we could either redraft the ordinance to include the fee, but then the largest tree that we could require to be replanted is 2 inches in diameter, or we could remove the fee requirement and just require replanting, and then if we're requiring replanting, we can do whatever we want. So that was the legal advice we were given at the time. I still disagree with it, but I will defer to whatever our current council also reviews. Because I probably have read through it too many times at this point and want it to say a certain thing. So I will acknowledge that. But I would like to say that I think we should look at that issue again, because I think that the criticism that I have received since we passed it is there are people who would like to just pay a fee. Now, I will say that when we were told that we had to remove the fee option to require trees larger than 2 inches in diameter, we looked at what Portland, Oregon does, and they have a good neighbor program where if you need to replant more trees than you have space to replant them, you can fill out a form, and we based our form that we have largely on what they have in Oregon, in Portland, where you can then fill out a form and you can find either a neighbor or a park or some other space that you and the city agree the trees are going to go. And so in effect, you're paying a fee through finding another place that the trees can go. So we're still getting the tree canopy. We're not just collecting fees as a city, which I think is what the intent of the state statute is there to deal with, is that cities wouldn't just use that as a fund to start to collect fees off of people trying to remove trees. So we did add the good neighbor replanting option. That's one of the forms that's in there, and passed the ordinance. And I will say that also in there that we did make some adjustments to the ordinance, not just in response to council members giving feedback, because we had a lot of good council feedback. And when we first started working on the ordinance, Councilmember Hunley, myself, and Councilmember Hudson, who's here, the three of us, I think, were pretty ready with it, but we did keep on working on it and having those public hearings and incorporating community feedback. So by the time we passed it, it was a 5-0 pass, and I don't think it would have been that if Gavin was saying it wouldn't have been that if we had passed it earlier in the process. So we did try to work on getting that moderate space. One of the significant changes that we made in response to one couple coming and telling us that they had bought multiple lots in the city that were heavily treed still because they had not been redeveloped and they had older small homes on them and tons of trees. They kind of just said, please don't make us cut down all of our trees trying to get ahead of this ordinance, because we want a treed lot, but we're also concerned about the cost in the future to certain lots that just have a significantly higher number of trees later to try to redevelop. So we did put a cap then in calculating the number of trees that you have to replant, that there's a cap on that amount so that we wouldn't penalize people and hopefully avoid a frenzy of cutting down trees all over the city. So that's kind of where we are. And there was a lot of discussion when we were passing it, knowing it wasn't in perfect form and that we would need more feedback over time, hoping that we would kind of figure out a process to do that, figuring that once we kind of got it moving, that we would have the opportunity for feedback from city staff, from residents, building community, and be able to make adjustments. So open to comments, open to adjustments, and all ears. That's it.
Well, thank you for bringing us along on that. That's very helpful. As you guys will recall, when we recodified, we had 3 or 4 ordinances that just need to be recodified from 3 to 14. We just recodified them. We didn't have a lot of public discussion on them because it had already been hashed out in public and we were recodifying. So this is an opportunity, I guess, for us to give input to city council or to accept input from the public on it. But as you heard, this is fairly well held in public for over a number of months, over half a year. So that was the intent of bringing this before y'all today, was just to get us an update on it. I know we'd heard some desire to strengthen it. Are there any questions that we have for Amy?
Currently, there is or is not a fee.
There is not a
There
fee
is not a
for
fee.
removal.
Okay.
There is if you remove without having the permitting, there is in the penalty section, there is a fine, but which is different, classified
There's no fee
different.
in lieu of replanting.
There's no fee in lieu.
That is
right.
one of the criticisms you've received. Is
Right.
that some people would like to just pay and cut the tree
Right,
down.
because it is, we don't necessarily have a function right now to identify where people could be replanting trees. So that does put the onus on the applicant to figure out where to replant. So there is effectively a fee in lieu of, which is the Good Neighbor Planting Program. Because we're still then adding canopy. We're not just collecting a fee. We're putting those trees somewhere in the city, but it doesn't require that person to do it on their own property if they don't have room.
And there's also, you have to obtain a permit to remove a dead tree.
Right.
As part of the oversight, you have to pay to get the permit to take out a dead tree. I'm wondering if there's a way that the city could actually sort of pay some of that money back as an incentive to plant maybe a bigger tree. If you go above the requirements, maybe there's a way for people to get money back. Because I think the ultimate goal is to plant trees,
Mm-hmm.
to keep our trees, if not have more. And so if that's the message that we want to send, then if there's a financial benefit to doing that, then we could just put it into a coffer of fees collected for permits or whatever.
Yeah, so the extent that the city is getting money right now, it's paying for kind of a small administrative fee, which technically doesn't qualify as a removal fee. That's my understanding. And then the cost of the city arborist to review the plan. So those are built in, but they're not fees in lieu of. They're just part of the cost of getting the permit.
And I would be reluctant to consider allowing people just to pay money to cut down a tree, because I think that goes against the objective of replanting trees.
I'll concur on that as well. Having seen it in Austin was charging an arm and a leg to cut down what were considered junk trees. It was hackberries on one property I had, that while I had the property, it changed where hackberries were out, and then they were in per the city arborist, and it was seemingly called a land grab, but it was a fee grab to the tune of $14,000. And so I'm glad that there's been some negotiation and some discussion around replanting. And then that allowing us to replant anywhere in the city is helpful. I think it does, as you said, it does kind of create a quasi fee in lieu that isn't a fee. So you can't just stroke a check and remove trees. You're still adding them back in, but they don't necessarily. This was something that came from Westlake, where Westlake does not allow you to put it on another property. And I've had at least one friend over on Brady Lane who was forced to replant a bunch of trees that then died because the canopy already spread over them. She already had larger trees, totally shaded, and the new trees couldn't survive. So.
And another thought was that you might have sort of a map of the city of Rollingwood where you have strategically found places where trees are needed, like along streets for shade, and that you might sort of note those areas, and if people do need a place to replant, you've already got kind of a
Spot to do it.
a guide for where that could happen.
And with that, I would go with the guide, just like the power lines need to be short. If you're doing it up front, it needs to be tall.
Yeah.
Only thing I have a little thing if, say you got some oak trees that you're treating and you're trying to save that were hurt by the drought years ago, if they die, I don't think you should be penalized having to pay a fee to remove them because you've been trying to treat them. So you
We've
might,
already paid.
you might think about that scenario. But, yeah, you know, we deal with municipalities all over, and, you know, more times than not, when we're developing stuff, we always take we mitigate the tree removal and plant new trees elsewhere. Same thing you're talking about, keep the canopy.
I hesitate to ask this, but I'm gonna ask it anyways, cause I would like to know, why no heritage tree ordinance? Why didn't we take some of our grandmother and grandfather trees and, protect them?
Oh, like in Austin where they have a certain,
Over 24
Right.
inches, I think it has to be passed by city council kind of thing. The one fight I've seen between neighbors came over a heritage tree on my block. where
Right.
It was cut down just willy-nilly, and someone went out there and threw himself in front of the cutters, basically, so.
Trying to get something passed.
if,
Okay.
I would say that,
That would be my comment.
Yeah, I would say that-
But we just needed something on the books, and we didn't wanna put something controversial in
Did something, okay.
the goal, like, going back to the initial goal, it was, there's people on both sides, right? And so there was that initial perspective that when Wendy and I were working on it and trying to think through things, it was like, all right, our ultimate goal is we're gonna allow removal, but you have to replace the canopy. So we,
But you don't have to replace the hackberry,
right.
only the protected.
Only the protected, but I think, so we did make a decision at one point in the process to only choose one diameter. And,
Okay, and that's
If-
the 12 inch.
and that's the 12 inch. And part of the reason for that is it's larger than what would trigger the state statute, because the state statute says you can't regulate under 10 inches. So it's 12, it's not heritage size, so it covers more trees. I had some discussions with different arborists and landscapers as well. Of course, if it was larger, that means we have more flexibility, but that was, so we just kind of put a number in there that had some good basis, and that would be focused on trees that provide a significant amount of canopy. And so, if there was a desire in the community to look at
Protect 'em.
having a separate diameter that we add, or a separate age, we could definitely work on that.
So that may be one area that we could ask the community if they're interested in a heritage tree. And this is one of the good things about our committee is we can discuss these things, and it's not in front of council causing so much drama, especially if we're
Right.
just talking about it.
But I think part of the discussion was groups of smaller trees
Yep.
that create a canopy, their root systems go together, and there's a lot of help for those trees. And so we don't wanna see those smaller tree canopies get, cut down because we're only protecting the larger heritage. And so
Yeah.
we did
We
go
did.
back and forth on it and
We
trying
did.
to find a size that we could,
Cause you guys wanna do one number, not have a two.
yeah.
Right, I mean, we could go back, because, I mean, a lot of, so, when you have trees that are growing together in a tree family, they can tend to be stronger, and then a good arborist can figure out if they need to take one out to allow all of them to grow stronger and all that kind of stuff. So there was one point in time where I was trying to like draft something where like if you had a certain number of certain sized ones within
Right.
a certain radius, because I was looking at different literature, and then we really were just trying to get something that like
You get
Was-
bogged down.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and that like we could come back later and say, okay, we set this diameter, we set this strategy for buildable area versus green space, we set this strategy for trees that are planted near electrical lines. Have we missed something? Are those things working? Is that getting us to the bigger picture goal, which is that as a city, there's at least I think a community ethic that we do want to have a tree canopy that is part of our aesthetic and also our environment. So
Trees between neighbors, I didn't quite understand that section. I read it a couple of times. What's your goal there, and what do you feel like the outcome was?
I don't know if it's been. Have you had to look at any yet where it's like a tree where roots are coming into one? So the goal was if the tree is actually like halfway in your yard or in your neighbor's yard, but it's a large tree where the root structure is extending out into another neighbor's yard, that it's still a removal of a tree if you take out the root structure, like a significant portion of the root structure that kills the neighbor's tree. So I do think that's a section that we added towards the end of the ordinance cycle, and I feel like it could use a little more clarity as well. It's one of the areas that I was hoping we would revisit at some point. So I appreciate that note.
I noticed where you have to bring in the neighbor to remove a tree that may have a root zone that extends into both. If the neighbor doesn't agree, does that tree stay then, or is it canopy removed? That's where I couldn't quite understand
You have to
it.
go to Texas state law, think on that, right?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Because if a tree's on said property and it comes over on yours, you can still.
That's a
Yeah,
true,
you can-
that's a true statement.
You can prune it.
Yeah, you can print it
You can
back
print
to
it.
your property
And
line.
if it kills it, that's the question, like, is it a good neighbor thing?
Um,
Or is it something we can regulate on somebody else's property? So if they cut the root structure at their property line and it kills your tree,
Yes.
that it's a shady area, we don't really know.
It's like a limb hanging over.
Well, but we did define it. We did define it in the ordinance so that if it's a certain portion of root now, and you do that, you're still responsible technically for the neighbor who killed the tree is responsible for the tree replacement. Probably the good neighbor thing to do would be to replace your neighbor's tree in their yard if they want it, right? Like if you kill your neighbor's tree by cutting off half of its root structure, we can't require that, but that was the.
I think you get in the fuzzy area too of the
It
root
is.
structure, which way, you don't know.
Well, they just
Until
define
you're
it as
there.
a diameter.
It's a diameter.
It's a foot for every inch of diameter.
What different tree species do different.
I'm curious, we've got a
I think that's
giant
an area where we need to
on
go.
the property line, and I get that it probably goes into state and all that, but the one that was cut down on our thing was on the property line. It was 6 inches inside, but with a lot of roots, and so I couldn't figure out. I'm trying to avoid lawsuits between neighbors, and trees seems to be one of the most popular creations of lawsuits in this town. So,
Well, we also have setback requirements that you can't build
Yep.
right up to the property line.
Yep.
And in the drainage ordinance, the drainage criteria ordinance, we had limits on, changing the topography, where you can't change the elevation at the property line, and it has to be sloped, like 4 to 1, I think, going away from the property line, which if somebody uses a RICP instead of building under the drainage criteria manual, that doesn't apply. But that also limits, so that you don't have somebody coming in and, digging down right next to the property line or building up where it would impact the.
well, so we had a buried electrical cable in my yard, and I brought in an arborist to airspade it because they wanted to just go right across the roots of a bunch of live oaks that were on my neighbor's side. And the general attitude amongst contractors is, the live oaks, they'll be fine. But they were burying this thing, it's an electric line, it had to go, I think 28 inches to top a conduit, which is deep. And they were getting into some decent sized roots. Now we airspaded it and we did it right to the tune of, I think, $2,500, but a lot of people aren't going to want to spend that. They'll just trench a pipe, and it would have just cut right along the roots. I don't know if a neighbor behind a fence would know that. I'm just curious. So, like, technically that should come before a tree ordinance, and a permit should be applied for when you're relaying any type of conduit in the setback with trees that are close. So it's one of those, from a city standpoint,
That'd be every
it's
lot.
gotta be something the city's aware of when they come in and apply for electrical line, where's that thing going?
That's a good question.
How close is it to trees? I mean, I care about it, I definitely don't wanna cheese off my neighbors by killing all their live oaks. But the original proposal from the contractors was, would have killed off a few of those live oaks, which is how they wanted to go across the roots of them. So it's one, why I get very frustrated with the city of Austin. They do have some very clear, you can't come here within the critical root zone. And I get that that's probably negotiation, but it's one thing within the city to help understand that, you know, Austin has quarter critical root zone where you're absolutely not allowed to put anything, then there's half, then there's full. So is that an area of interest? I mean, mine was a unique case.
Yeah. So what I will say about the critical root zones and that type of issue is, I had several people suggest, why don't you just take the city of Austin's ordinance and apply it here because they've already done all the work. And so we did look at it, and they also have a giant team of staff who only do this, and multiple arborists and so
I'll be happy to talk about
so-
that if anybody wants to talk about that.
so I would say that anything we decide to do, and there may even be too much now for our city.
Yep.
Anything we decide to do, like somewhere it has to get paid for. And so there probably is interest in talking about that. And so I would just
Practicality
caution,
of it.
so I would caution, just the one word would be, if we're gonna talk about it, anything that's in there, I think that needs to be revisited, we should revisit. We just have to look at how we're gonna actually pay for it. And then what the staffing is available to do it. So right now, we really put the onus on the property owner to go and read it and look at when they're either putting in their building permit or whatever it is, whatever it is they're doing, to come in and do that process. And a lot of people are doing it. But unlike the city of Austin, we just don't have that arm to be able to go out and check it the same way that they do. We just don't. The CRZs are not getting checked.
Yep.
The same way that the city of Austin would do that.
Critical
The critical
root
root
zone.
zones.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's a great question.
I appreciate all the hard work that council did on it.
Yeah,
You wanna talk about it? Sure.
yeah.
Come on
I
up.
would love to hear Carrie talk about it because she's the one seeing all of the.
She's managing the ship.
Yes, perfect.
Carrie Kaler, Development Services Manager. So what I've been seeing is kind of two situations. One is residents who have a tree that dies, that they want to remove. Haven't had any issues there. Have had very few, in general, I've had very few residents living in their homes approach me and say, hey, I've got a dead tree, I need to remove it. I've had one person interested in the Good Neighbor program and donating a tree to the park because it didn't make sense with his lot and with his canopy to put a tree back. So he's offered it for the park. We have not yet replanted it, but it's in the works. And then you have builders, contractors coming in. What we've been doing is taking their tree survey, having it reviewed by the arborist, looking at how many trees need to be replaced, and then tying the replacement of those trees to the certificate of occupancy for the home. So they will not get their certificate of occupancy until they have replanted those trees. The critique of that is you have people coming in, demoing a home, taking trees off a lot, and then the lot sits either empty or under construction for a period of time. It doesn't make sense to require replanting before construction because things change during construction, plans change, the trees could get damaged, the root zones could get impacted. So requiring replanting during construction does not seem like a good option. As far as enforceability, there's certain things that are just going to be hard to enforce. Like, it's a great idea to, if people are treating trees and it dies, to not charge them. However, for staff to try to figure out who's treating trees actively and trying to save them and who's not, I don't think that's really very practical for where we are as a city. And I feel like there's a liability of us telling residents, well, it's okay, you don't have to pay because your tree died of natural causes, but yours didn't, so you have to. I feel like that's a sticky area for us to get into. The tree dies, you remove it.
I got you.
Maple tree.
Right now, what I'm looking at are permits that were issued prior to the ordinance and permits that were issued after the ordinance.
Interesting.
So I've got people who got a permit before, I think, February 1st, who did not have to follow or comply with any of that. I've got people who are under permit right now that I'm just waiting on. So this hasn't really had time to be tested yet, because none of the properties that are under construction that removed trees have gotten to the replanting stage. So, you know,
Still remains to be seen how
it
it
does,
works out. Okay.
how it works out. I don't see any problems. You know, it's in their file that they will have to replant. You know, the problem is for neighbors seeing the trees being removed and the heartbreak of that without seeing the replanting for, you know, maybe 2 years.
Yep.
So,
Any additional questions from the dais? Any areas of this ordinance that you guys feel like you want planning and zoning to take on from council? Yeah. Please come on up, sir.
Sarah Hudson, 2805 Rockway. I was not aware that this item was on the agenda until last night when I mentioned something to Amber and Carrie and Ashley.
We post all our
last-
stuff out there
I
by the
know,
door.
I
You
know,
can pass
I know,
by.
I hadn't paid
I
attention.
know you're
But
not
anyway,
down here that much, but
this was good timing because I have an item that I would like you all to consider maybe adding to.
does it involve trees?
It does. Related to the trees. But right now, we have situations, a number of places throughout the community where somebody has bought a house, demoed, cut down trees, and then it sits. And nothing is being built. And meanwhile, the trees are gone. And in some cases, the trees are gone, and then they come in with a building permit, hopefully based on the fact that they have taken out these trees. The one right across the street from me, the plan that they turned in doesn't comply with the setbacks. So now they're gonna have to redesign, and who knows if all the trees that they took down needed to come down, because they don't have a plan yet for what they're putting in. And these were big oak trees in the backyard. And I woke up one morning and walked out the door and I heard the splintering sound of trees being torn down by a backhoe. So as part of the demolition process, it is not necessarily done in a sound manner, right? Probably not the ideal manner to remove trees with a backhoe instead of an arborist or somebody that's coming in there and actually doing a responsible tree removal process. I would like to see if there was a way that we could not have the tree removal be a part of the demolition process, but require that before the trees can be taken down, they have to have, so it's the first step before they start building instead of part of the demolition process. So that way the trees are there longer, they actually know what they're wanting to put in before they take out the trees, And then we have hopefully a little better process, because while I am all in favor of planting new trees, I think we're way better off keeping the trees that we have, because the trees that are going back in are way smaller. We're not replacing 100-year-old oak trees.
Well, and it's also a different climate, so they're not, the trees that are thriving now are the ones you want to keep, but trying to establish new trees is much more challenging with
Right, it's kind of the bird in the hand
less
idea.
hotter temperatures,
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah. The trees that are there we know are doing well, and the trees that you replace, maybe they make it and maybe they don't. So anything that we can do to limit the trees that come out, or the timing, or at least make sure that there's a good plan for what they're going to put in, and a demonstrated need to take out the tree before it comes out, I think that would be
Can I comment?
helpful.
please.
I think that that's an excellent suggestion, to have a tree sort of permit review before you issue a demo permit, or somehow tie those two things together. I think that's a good idea.
It's a good heads up.
Just
I would ask if
something
there's
to consider.
language that you can think of that maybe bring that. Does that make sense? Like, that's the hard
I can
part, is
think on
trying
that,
to
yes.
craft it. Yeah.
I just wanted to throw that out there. If you all are
Okay.
starting to take a look at things, ways that we can tweak what we have, that's something that I would like us to consider, and see if we can come up with something that just change the timing on when the trees can come out.
Okay. Any further questions? Okay, thank you very much for the educational session. We appreciate it. I think it was very helpful. We're going to close 4 and move on to 5, which is an update of actions by City Council with regards to recommendations.
Amber Lewis, City Administrator. I'm going to pull this up. First of all, I want to introduce you to our new Director of Public Works, David Brasich. He comes to us from the city of Bastrop, where he was the building official. And prior to that, he was the Public Works Director in Westlake Hills. And he's got so many credentials, I can't even remember them all, but he's a certified building official, certified floodplain manager, master plumber, and there's 2 others that I always forget, but very experienced, already hitting the ground running, got some ideas, and so we're excited to have him and wanted him to meet you all.
Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you.
Okay, the first bullet point is regarding the public hearing tonight and why it was back in front of you. Just
Yep.
wanted to inform you that council couldn't take action at the last meeting. This bullet point is also about David. This one, the flood damage prevention ordinance didn't have to come before you, but did want to make you aware that the council adopted a new FEMA floodplain map, and it's also possibly time to look at some of our building ordinances and see if there are some things that we can do to help protect homeowners from being prone to flood at their homes. And so some things that, some recommendations we're getting from the engineer may have to come before you, some may not, but I just wanted to make you aware of that.
Do you think that map will play into, as we're looking at potentially changing zoning for the majority, does that floodplain, will it affect some of that, or? Potentially, I mean, are there any drastic differences that of which we should be aware?
Not that we
Okay.
could see, there weren't any
Okay.
changes.
Okay. Okay.
So, the city council's directed staff to issue an RFP for engineering services, actually RFQ, and it's just their turn. We're working through all of our contractors that have contracts that are older than 5 years, and LNV's is 7 years old, so it's their time. The site plan for Austin I was approved. The Commercial Corridor Task Force will be set up soon. And then we're currently working on ordinances to remove the masonry requirements to remain consistent with state law. And that some of those might be brought before you.
Thank you.
Yep.
The RFP,
Yes.
did anybody?
We did not get anybody to respond. We issued an addendum to open it up to February 28th, and I think we might have one interested in responding. So hopefully we'll be able to have interviews for you at the next,
For reviewing of zoning.
for the comprehensive plan.
Comprehensive plan. Okay.
Right,
So nobody made it in by the original deadline, but we've adjusted. Okay.
yes.
I also reached out to several people at the University of Texas in planning development to see if that's something that any of the professors or grad students would be interested in taking up.
Okay.
I haven't had any responses yet, but we'll see if anybody comes back interested.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate it. On to our final, which is just discussion of any plans for future meeting dates. We're cruising along. The next one we may have, we had a few ideas for this one because we thought we might have to come back for it, so we decided to do tree ordinances. There's a few other items in the fire that we may be coming back for, so plan for first Wednesdays of the month to be here.
I will not be here in March.
Okay.
Checking.
Um,
It's the 4th.
Yes.
and then just know that I think July 4th is a conflict, but we're trying not to meet that anyways. So, okay. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So move.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, we are adjourned unanimously. Thank you.